Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. All right. Kris, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, Kris, you're the author of Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. You're also the senior producer of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Under Our Skin. Let's start where you began the book. How'd you get bitten?
My husband and I and our two middle school boys went to Martha's Vineyard for a vacation. We were there a week. We came back to California, and all of a sudden we had flu-like symptoms, but they were really intense. So we went to the doctor and they said, well, that's just a flu virus, summer flu, go away, come back if it gets worse. But in like a couple days, we went back because it was so bad. We were just so weak and debilitated. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to get up to our bedroom. So we went back and the doctor said, well, I think this is just really a virus. Let me check with infectious disease. And so she checked with infectious disease and they said, well, and I said, it could be Lyme disease. We're on Martha's Vineyard. It was the number 2 state for Lyme disease that year. And the head of infectious disease said, no, Lyme disease is really, really rare. We're not even test for it. So that sort of attitude, even though it's a cheap test for Lyme disease, went on for about 8 months. And finally, we went to an academic medical center and they did about every day for a year, we got sicker. So if you're a healthy person, you're used to being down for a couple days with the flu and then you bounce back. But every day for this year, for basically a year, we felt worse and worse and worse. And the symptoms would move around. It felt like we had Alzheimer's, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia with pain everywhere, irritable bowel syndrome. And by the time we were bitten in July, like most people, and by the time we got around to January, it was serious. And I could no longer work. My husband went to work because we needed health insurance to figure out what was going on. And we had gone in the space of a year, 10 doctors, $60,000. That's the straight medical cost just to get diagnosed. So finally, Stanford, the academic medical center, gave us the Lyme test and it was positive, but they refused to treat us because the infectious diseases group there follows the guidelines of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, that's IDSA, and they say chronic Lyme doesn't work, it doesn't exist, so
right.
We can't treat you. And later I got to know that doctor and he says, well, I would have been fired if I had treated you with long-term antibiotics. So the irony of it was that the symptoms we had, and we got them on the same day, are not what was on the CDC's website or in the medical textbooks that are written by these IDSA people. So mainstream doctors, they want you to get better, but this looks like something different. And so then that launched me in, we found a Lyme doctor online. She'd been trained. She treated thousands of Lyme patients. She saw us and said, this is classic Lyme. She treated us with long-term antibiotics. She diagnosed a tick-borne co-infection, which is babesiosis. It's like American malaria, and you need a different class of drugs for that. So over the course of 5 years, we were on and off antibiotics and finally cured. But while that first year, I said, well, this is obviously a disease of ignorance. And if I just create a documentary, because I was a writer in communications, then everybody will be educated and the system will be fixed. But it turned out to be more complicated. But the film came out at Tribeca in 2008, and it was on an Oscar shortlist in 2010. But
wow.
So that was the film. Do you have any more questions before I go in my story?
What year were you bitten?
July of 2002.
You didn't get tested for 8 months, you said?
Yeah. The California doctors, they said, it's a rare disease. We're not going to test you for it. And along the way, one infectious diseases doctor told us we should seek mental health services. I was a jealous Silicon Valley wife, and I was jealous of my husband's success, and he was mirroring my symptoms out of empathy. He says, I would
Oh
call
my
that a
goodness.
psychosomatic couples thing. But, this was like February after we'd been bitten in the summer, and we both felt like we were dying. Secretly, we were thinking we might have to put our kids up for adoption. It always felt like we were 1 month away from having to sell our house so we can pay for our medical expenses. You lose a lot of friends because you can't do anything but the bare essentials of being an adult in this society. And so friends fell away. Every time we saw friends at the grocery store or whatever, they go, "Are you okay yet? You're over that, right?" But it went on, and I
Right.
really couldn't believe we were in supposedly the best medical system in the world, and they couldn't figure this out. And it turned out to be a simple tick-borne disease.
Wow. And so the treatment was what is long-term antibiotic usage? What does that look like?
At first, when your germ load is really high, we had 2 tick-borne diseases, you start out slowly. So it was just oral Zithromax. The first time you're treated, it's not intuitive, but you get worse because you have a die-off of these organisms, which are in your brain and your joints. So all your symptoms you had before are worse. So once you clear out the germs, then you treat more aggressively. So Babesia is this parasite. So you use an anti-parasite first to get rid of the parasite. And then you start the hardcore Lyme treatment, which is an antibiotic cocktail because the Lyme spirochetes, they have the spirochetal form that's really good at drilling into your tissues and inside your blood-brain barrier and your joints.
Yeah.
But once it gets there, then it sets up camp and it can go into a dormant form. So you need a different antibiotic to kill it in this cell wall-less form.
Wow.
So anyways, after about a year, we could work again, but then it keeps relapsing unless you
Mm.
kill the germs and improve your immune system over a longer period of time. So we would have to go on and off these cocktails until it was gone. And the thing that finally cured me was IV antibiotics because
Wow.
that way it bypasses your liver and goes directly to your brain. And that's where I was bitten at the
Wow.
base of my neck and they just did a beeline into my brain.
Oh
I
my
mean, I was
goodness. So
so oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say literally drugs to the main line.
Right, right, which is expensive, and that's why, medical insurance doesn't wanna acknowledge that chronic Lyme exists because, wow, that'd cost them a lot of money.
Right. Right. And can you describe what a tick, how a tick operates? I mean, it doesn't have eyes. How, it looks for CO2, carbon dioxide from humans and other mammals, and how it bites and how it transmits disease.
Yeah, so ticks on the East Coast, they tend to crawl up to the tip of a blade of grass, and then they have these sticky pads on their front arms. And they don't really have eyes, at least the deer ticks don't have eyes, and so they sense the CO2. When you brush up to them, these sticky, fatty pads stick onto you, and they also have legs with grappling hooks like velociraptors that grab on too. And then as you're walking along, they crawl really fast, and they try to find a nice, warm, damp place on your body. So my husband, they bit him on the back of his knee. They were the back of my hairline. We probably had the bullseye rash or a round expanding rash, but those are places you don't normally look. Um,
Right.
yeah. And so then what happens is the tick has like little claws and they dig a hole. They dig a little hole in your skin. Their saliva releases a numbing agent. So you don't feel the tick. It doesn't hurt. And also anticoagulant so that your blood doesn't create a scab over it. And then its stomach, which is sort of like a bellows, starts going like this. And as the blood pools in this little hole, the bellows suck it up. So with Lyme disease, The spirochetes are in the bellows, the midgut, and mostly it takes a while to drill and lap up the blood and have the backwash basically go into your bloodstream. But sometimes the spirochetes are in the saliva, and you can get infected really fast within an hour or two.
Within an hour? I've heard I thought it was 24 hours.
Well, the mainstream says 24 to 78 hours, but I talked to the tick specialist who discovered Lyme disease, and he said, oh, I've seen it as fast as an hour, because if they're in the saliva, they can be. Okay, so then once the spirochetes get into your bloodstream, they change the surface protein of the of their organism so they can hitch a ride on your red blood cells. And so then they go to the far reaches of your capillaries, and then they're like a corkscrew. And you know how effective a corkscrew is into drilling into solid stuff. So it can drill through your cartilage, through your blood-brain barrier, into your joints, because your immune system doesn't get into those places very well. And like I said, sets up camp. It's a bacteria, so it's more sophisticated than most any other bacteria. It can divide like a normal bacteria, or it can swap genetic material with another spirochete and then go on their own merry way. Or sometimes it forms these gummy balls and cover themselves in a biofilm, so your immune system can't get to the organisms in the middle, can kill the ones on the outside. So that's why it's really hard to get rid of it, those reasons.
Yeah. And you said in your book, ticks have been around for 120 million years. They've bitten, I mean, you put it so nicely, they've bitten the dinosaurs, literally.
Right. They found them in amber. So they're just really good at getting a blood meal. And so you just have to be careful as a human being. So do tick checks after your hikes.
Yeah.
Before we went to Martha's Vineyard, my friends sent us a brochure on how to do tick checks, and we were good about it. But what we didn't think about is that we would go bushwhacking at the beach, and then we'd take off our clothes, and they're beach clothes, so you don't wash them every day, and we would put them on the next day. So I think maybe they were hanging out on our second day clothes. Or it could be she had a hairy golden retriever, and maybe when we're gone, the golden retriever sleeps on our bed and ticks drop off. So you have to be vigilant.
Well, PSA before we turn to Willie Bergdorfer, for folks who do get a tick, and very few people know this, the best way to remove a tick is to soak it in Vaseline for about a minute to suffocate the tick so it dies. So when you go to extract the tick with tweezers, you're pulling out the entire tick and not letting the remainder burrow deeper into the skin. So I learned as a Boy Scout.
I would modify that, though.
Let's hear it.
Okay. Respectfully, if you put the Vaseline on it, what happened is it might have a violent vomiting reaction, and whatever's in the gut ends up in your body. So most people say it's just better to pull it out as quick as possible. So get a tweezers and put it as close between the skin and the mouth parts and quickly jerk it out. Because once it feels you're messing with it, it's going to dig in with its little grappling hooks.
Okay.
So, and then what I advise is put the tick in a plastic baggie with a little piece of damp paper towel and send it into a lab for testing. And the reason why I say that, it can be free in certain states. It can be free for the military to test it. It may cost $75 to test all tick-borne diseases, but the human test for Lyme disease only works after the first month, because it's an antibody test and it takes that long while. And then those tests are usually only testing for one strain from the East Coast. And if you're in California, it's a different strain of Borrelias that can make you sick. And then there's the co-infections like the babesiosis, the deadly heartland virus, etc. So if you send the tick in, like maybe the tick didn't transmit it, who knows, but you'll have the list of all the germs in the tick. And so then you'll know what symptoms to look for. You can show it to your doctor and say, well, this isn't just the flu. because I have,
Right.
spotted fever and babesiosis, so if you're a worrier, especially I would do that. Now, there's a new test out, which I would recommend, and it's from this company in California called IGeneX, IGENEX. And they just released a new test that it's just more inclusive. It tests for the California strains and for the East Coast strains. So check that out. I can't remember the name of it, but that's the way to go because it's just Lyme is not the problem. As you know, reading my
Right.
book.
Yes, yes. And Lyme is hard to test for. It's sometimes there's a lot of false negatives. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Because of it's an antibody it's an antibody test. It takes your body a couple weeks to develop antibodies. I think we found that out with COVID antibody tests. It doesn't work right away. And then it's the strain, the different strains. The fact that the test that we used was developed in 1990 based on a lab-grown strain from Long Island. So it doesn't capture the strains that have been mutating because it's so genetically adept. And it's it's mutagenic, so it's a shapeshifter. So it doesn't test for this stuff that's in California and Missouri and all that.
So this is a
And
test that's
also
35 years old.
what now?
This is a test that's 35 years old? I mean, that sounds pretty antiquated.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'm excited about the IGeneX test.
That's great. And maybe we could talk a little bit about, just before we go on, so the different types of ticks and then the different, there's Rocky Mountain spotted fever, what you have mentioned, I'm probably mispronouncing it, babesiosis, and then, of course, Lyme, and then there are the different ticks that you mentioned, deer tick, Lone Star tick, dog tick, and Rocky Mountain wood tick.
Mhm.
Can we run
Yes.
through those?
Sure. So in a normal evolutionary world, certain microbes adapt themselves to certain ticks. I mean, it's like their territory, they own it. But I think we've had a massive mashup of ticks and diseases. So the rules of the road that were in 1950 are different than they are now. But okay, so most people on the East Coast, Lyme disease is carried by the deer tick, the Ixodes
Right.
tick. And so that's Lyme disease and babesiosis. On the eastern seaboard, badass tick called the Lone Star tick, which previously was in the southern United States. The military was experimenting with it on coastal Virginia. And what they were doing is, at that time, it was the middle of the tick weaponization program, where Fort Detrick, our biological weapons program, was experimenting with putting dangerous diseases in ticks, either incapacitating or deadly diseases. And they needed a tick that was versatile and could survive. So Lone Star ticks, it can stay in the freezer for a year and still be alive. It can be underwater for 70, 80 days and still be alive. So it's very hardy. And then it's also aggressive. It's a tick that has rudimentary eyes on its shoulders. So it doesn't just have to wait for a passing mammal to grab on. It can actively stalk a human or a dog or whatever. So, I mean, I was on the beach in Martha's Vineyard, like way away from the grass, and there they were marching towards me. It's like screaming, ah!
Uh,
So the problem with the Lone Star tick, besides being aggressive and stalking, is that it carries two new diseases that were introduced to the East Coast. And because this tick is more aggressive, it's sort of taking over the deer tick space. And so those two diseases are Rocky Mountain spotted fever and the alpha-gal red meat allergy, which is transmitted through a protein in the tick saliva when it attaches. And so let me get back to the military experiments. So there was a university professor who was funded by the Army and the Atomic Energy Commission. And because they were weaponizing this tick, they had to know, the military people had to know, like, how far would it creep and crawl and fly on the backs of birds and spread if we weaponize these ticks? So this professor who's still alive, his brilliant idea was, let's make those ticks radioactive. So what he did in Virginia is he gridded off an acre or so into 1 meter squares, and he would drop 1,000 radioactive ticks in each square. And then they would creep and crawl and do their stuff. Birds would pick them up, raccoons or whatever. And then the next month they go out and collect the ticks in each square and measure how far they'd creeped. This professor also did bird studies. And so it's uncontrolled. You're making ticks radioactive. Are you forcing mutations in those ticks? And the other question is, Willy Bergdorfer gave the seed ticks to this professor who released these ticks. And he had a zoo of ticks and tick diseases from around the world in his lab in Montana. And were all those clean ticks, or were some of those ticks infected with relapsing fever bugs from Africa? We don't know. But anyways,
Wow.
a year or two after he started these uncontrolled, aggressive tick experiments, all of a sudden there was a huge spotted fever outbreak in Long Island. And Long Island,
Right.
if you're a bird migrating, it takes 5 days to get up there. So
From Virginia.
yeah. So anyways, that's my hypothesis of how lone stars got up there. We need academics to study that to prove it.
And what year were these Virginia trials being done?
It was like 1966 through 68 when the biological weapons program was theoretically shut down. And
Wow.
and then the first time they noticed established colonies of the Lone Star ticks was 1 or 2 years after that on Long Island.
Right. Right. And you write the first cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever were 1968, 17 cases on Cape Cod, Nantucket Vineyard. And then there was a resurgence in 1971, 124 cases on Long Island.
Yeah, and people
So
died. People died. Yeah.
Wow. And so you believe that the Rocky Mountain spotted fever is likely a result of biological weapons testing?
Not exactly. So I interviewed Willy Bergdorfer towards the end of his life, and he had actually acquired Lyme disease from his laboratory testing. Infected rabbit urine went into his eyes. So I think he finally understood what the patients were complaining about with this disease. And he said, I'm sort of sorry the germ was named after me. But what he said, and he was very reluctant to say that, is when I was sent out to investigate whatever was making people sick around Long Island and Lyme, Connecticut, I didn't just find the spirochete. I found another organism, and I think that was related to some of the bioweapons testing that my lab participated in. And when I pushed him to say, well, how did it get out of the lab, or what was happening? And he says, sometimes experiments don't turn out the way they're planned. Accidents happen. So he died before he would give up the secrets. I mean, he was afraid that he would be deported. He was threatened with having his health insurance removed and his retirement. So he was afraid. So that left me to put the pieces together as best I could. And I still don't know, like, where. So first of all, it's not just Lyme. There's this mystery disease, which best guessed is related to spotted fever. It belongs to the genre of bacterium called rickettsias. It's very tiny, almost virus size. It invades your cells inside and just messes up your metabolism. And then the third disease that was found around the late 60s, the height of the biological weapons program, is babesiosis, which is a cattle parasite. In 68 or 67, I think it was found for the second time in the U.S. in man. So the question is, how did it cross over to man? Now there is, I think, like 12 miles as the crow flies from Lyme, Connecticut, there was a bioweapons lab targeted at killing animals during the Cold War. Did it get out there? No one knows. Or there was also a Navy base right near the outbreak. There was also Pfizer, who was developing antibiotics for all these bioweapons. So, there were three possible sources for that outbreak, and we don't know yet where it came from.
I've heard some of the skeptics have said that, well, Lyme disease has been around for well before the late 1960s. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, they look at the ticks in archives. Yeah, they had something close to Borrelia burgdorferi. But whatever outbreak started in the late 60s, it was especially virulent. And the naysayers say, oh, well, Ötzi the Iceman, 5,300 years ago, they sequenced his DNA and found Lyme disease in it. And no, I talked to the scientists at Lawrence Livermore Lab who sequences really complex germs for the U.S. military when there's a suspicious outbreak. And he's an IT guy, and he has or bioinformatics guy, and he has a very sophisticated algorithm because, as you can imagine, decoding a 5,300-year-old piece of DNA would be difficult. And he said, no, they did not prove that Ötzi the Iceman had Lyme disease. He had something from the same class of bacteria as Borrelia, but that could be gingivitis. So, there's a lot of there's hundreds and hundreds of Borrelias. So it's not necessarily Lyme disease.
So maybe we could just take a step back and talk a little bit about Willie, and because he's really is the key person in your book, and maybe we can introduce him. Who was he? Where is he from? And where did he work?
So Willie was born in Basel, Switzerland, a smart guy, and he went to the Tropical Institute of Medicine and got an equivalent of a PhD in medical zoology. He was a specialist in ticks. And in the Cold War, there was general paranoia around 51 of what the Russians had done. Because after World War II, the Russians and we split up the Nazi scientists, the Japanese scientists who were working on biological, chemical, and rocketry.
Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip, exactly. So Willie was working in the Swiss Tropical Institute, and he was recruited specifically to work on Q fever, which is a biological weapon, and ticks, weaponizing ticks. And he was brought over to Hamilton, Montana, where the BioLevel lab was working on that. It was our national repository of ticks around the world. So he started off on the insect weaponization program. So he was trying to put plague and fleas and yellow fever virus in mosquitoes and all sorts of diseases, rabies, other spirochetes in ticks. And so the intent was to develop the perfect stealth weapon. So we would have these loaded bugs, drop them on the enemy. They would, before ground forces came in, and it would weaken the general population. It would tie up their medical facilities and personnel. So that was the plan. So he was brought over, and he was contracting with Fort Detrick, which is the biological weapons headquarters in Maryland. And so Pentagon would send over a wish list. Okay, we hear there's this thing called tick paralysis. Can you isolate that chemical so we can manufacture that and put it in dart guns so we can neutralize dogs or guards? And he did that. Or can you figure out how to mass produce mosquitoes by the million? And they brought over the mosquitoes that carry malaria and dengue fever and Zika. And he was in Hamilton mass producing those. And then what they do is send it to Dugway to drop the mosquitoes and see how far they would spread in the Utah desert. So he was in charge of doing all these kind of experiments. And then the biological weapons program ended. It was wound down between 68 and 72. And he went back to more mainstream research, but he was called in to investigate while these people were getting sick around Long Island.
Wow. And what did he do in the latter half of his career after the biological weapons piece ended?
He was in charge of rickettsias, so spotted fever.
Okay.
And he was originally called out to look at the people dying of spotted fever on Long Island, and that's when he discovered the spirochetes too. But, like these Lyme spirochetes had been in Europe earlier, but the thing that's different is these were especially virulent. So the question is, was the Lyme spirochete genetically modified or not? So I couldn't find
I see.
proof. So people say, oh,
Right.
Lyme disease could never be a bioweapon. It's just like, yes, because it's so slow growing and it only grows in living tissue. So the nice thing about rickettsias, why they, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, was a bioweapon on their short list, because you can take those organisms, put them in a stainless steel tank, and just reproduce them by the ton. And then they
Oh
would
my
take
goodness.
those and freeze dry the spores and spray them in vehicles or planes.
Is there
Large.
any dispute? Is there any dispute that ticks were used, tested for, experimented, we'll say, for biological weapons? Has that been disputed, or is that considered fact?
I would consider it absolute fact, because
Okay.
I I mean, the guy who did it, Willy Bergdorfer, told me. His colleague Jim Oliver told me they did it. The guy who released the ticks in Virginia said they did it. They were all being paid by the program to do it. Also, my book is heavily based on Willy Bergdorfer's lab notebooks, letters, because before he died, he gave his lab notebooks, including the ones that detailed the biological weapons experiments, to a guy in Utah who scanned them and then put them at UVU, the Utah University that's very, very much in the news this week. So
Yeah.
all his files are online there for anyone to look at. So yeah, tick weaponization, absolutely fact. Was Lyme a bioweapon? The jury's still out. And then the other thing is, did it come from Plum Island? The jury's still out. It's very close. Plum Island did have a tick hatchery where they raised millions of ticks. They had safety breaches, well documented. According to anecdotal evidence, they did outdoor testing with ticks, but not proven.
Wow. And just for folks' geography's sake, Plum Island is in the Long Island Sound between the North Shore of Long Island and the South Shore of Connecticut, where, as the crow flies, about 12 miles from Old Lyme, Connecticut, which, of course, is what the Lyme disease is named after.
Yeah, and there's reports of deer swimming across the sound. And, of course, birds. It's like super easy to fly back and forth. I was standing on the Lyme Beach Club, and you can see Plum Island right out there. It's very close.
Wow. And Plum Island the operations were closed and moved to Kansas, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And now they're deciding what to do with it. Plum Island, there was a paperclip Nazi, Traub, who was brought over, and he helped design the facilities there. They wanted him to be a director, but the Congress put their hands up. No way. And so I do think he was working for the government on the side, going to Columbia, et cetera. But I haven't really dug into that, because I stayed focused on what caused this freaky outbreak in such a small area. The mouth of the Connecticut River, the mouth of the Thames River. And I created an animated map, and you can see it's a point source outbreak that spread,
Yeah.
and now this disease is spread up through Maine and Canada, and they're dealing with it, and in the Midwest and in the Carolinas. So it's It's out of control. There's 500,000 cases of Lyme disease alone per year. That's about
Wow.
average 1,300 a day. And we still don't have a good treatment or a good test.
And there was a vaccine at one point, right? What
Mhm.
happened there?
So, Connaught and Glaxo, I can't remember if it's GlaxoSmithKline or SmithKline Beecham, but there were two vaccines that were in development late 80s, and then only one of them made it to market. And there were reports of adverse effects for both of those. I would recommend, if you want to know more about the vaccine development, where it went wrong, and the adverse effects, read Pam Weintraub's book, Cure Unknown. I don't want to get into the weeds of that, but they were they were pulled. And so now there is another Pfizer vaccine that's in phase 3 of the clinical trials. So
Really?
that'll be coming out soon.
Wow. And by you mean soon for direct to consumer usage? Are we talking a year, 2 years?
I don't know. I don't know. I worry a little bit that it uses the same strategy as the two other failed vaccines, but I'll wait and see the data. We all would love to have a Lyme vaccine, but I question whether that vaccine is solving the right problem. Because
Okay.
if you're bitten by a tick, and there can be a mashup of 20 different diseases or disease causing microbes in there. Actually, around Long Island Sound, study was done there. It's like 25% you'll get more than one germ. And the tick
Right.
bite suppresses your immune system. So, you know, by preventing Lyme disease, you're not going to prevent things like babesiosis, or which can kill you if you don't have a spleen, or Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which can put you in a coma in 14 days, or deadly Powassan and Heartland virus. So, is it solving the right problem? There are other vaccines that approach keeping ticks from attaching in the first place, or counteracting their saliva so you can feel it, and so
Right.
so that's
And
just my
so,
opinion.
I mean, there's this alpha gal syndrome. I mean, where did that come from? And you had mentioned in your book, climate change, deer population explosion, humans incursion in the tick habitats, possible release of ticks by scientists. Are all these conflating factors?
Yeah, it's nature. It's a really complex system, as complex of a system as anything. Uh, so there's a new thing coming out of MIT and Tufts where they're going to genetically modify mice and put this protein, this vaccine protein in the mice, and release them on Nantucket. And to me, that horrifies me, because like mice are the foundational food source on Nantucket, and it's not a closed system. It's not it's not like doing an experiment in the biodome. Also, we don't know what this gene splice using CRISPR will do to the predators that eat the mice. How will it ripple through the food chain? In the same way that humans thought it was a good idea to just use DDT to kill all the insects, and then all of a sudden you find out that it's irreversibly harm the birds. Their eggs
Right.
don't come to hatching stage. So yeah. So the
It's
problem with the ticks is we had these uncontrolled experiments. Now we have non-native things in this area. Maybe they're genetically modified. We don't know, but in a normal evolutionary process, the mammals would slowly develop immunity for these things. But instead, it was released all at once. There was a mass die off, and now we're stuck with a nature out of balance. And then on top of that, the fact that climate is changing. A lot of times on the eastern seaboard, it's freezes aren't killing off the tick population. So the tick populations are growing. Also, people are building houses in the woods and in tick habitat. So it's a
and so
complicated thing. And it would have been if the military had fessed up on what was going on with the weaponized ticks in the beginning, we could have controlled it. I mean, we could have done limited DDT spraying just to
Sure.
to kill the alien spawn and the frankengerms.
Right.
But now their denial has created something that's out of control. So we need to get our best scientific minds to develop a multi-layered strategy for controlling these diseases.
I mean, and that brings me to my next question. You write how the CDC vastly underspends in research on Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses as compared to other illnesses. What's going on there?
Yeah. So NIH provides the bulk of
NIH, okay.
the funding. Yeah. CDC does have a small pot too, but the problem with NIH is they have sort of bought into the Lyme disease is easy to treat and cure with a couple weeks of antibiotics thing. And the people who control the NIH grant committees, they believe that. I mean, they may not be Lyme experts, but they just believe what their Yale and Harvard experts tell them. And they, plus, so they haven't viewed it as a crisis, unlike the people that are living with chronic Lyme. So it's just a fraction. They dedicate a fraction of the amount that goes to like AIDS or malaria, which is mostly outside of the country. And then I analyzed 600 grants on the NIH database for the last 13 years, and only 2% of the whole budget, which is small anyways, is spent on better treatments. The problem with the Lyme treatments are depending on what study you read, 10 to 20% to 30% of the people that take the recommended treatment for early Lyme go on to have symptoms. And then the specialists won't let them have long-term antibiotics to get over it. I mean, it took 5 years back then for me to get over it. So we're just throwing these people under the bus. Go ahead.
Well, what's the resistance to the idea of chronic Lyme disease?
Well, my hypothesis is that Lyme disease is a relapsing fever like every other Borrelia family member in that bacterial kingdom, which means it blossoms and goes dormant depending on the environmental conditions in a body. And you can't run a scientifically valid vaccine trial if you have a germ like that. It's like AIDS. It's why we don't have a vaccine for AIDS, because it's wily. It's very sophisticated, more sophisticated than can be controlled with a vaccine. But in my film that I worked on with Andy Abrahams with, what I did is research. I followed the money trail. So what happened about the same time that AIDS was discovered and Lyme was discovered, all of a sudden the laws changed so that scientists at the NIH, the CDC, and universities could become business partners with Big Pharma. So Big Pharma looked at this Lyme disease. Oh, great. What a profit opportunity. But the way to cure it is pull out a tick and take 2 weeks of antibiotics right away. Cheap antibiotics, off patent, cost maybe $10.
Right.
Well, that's not a business plan. So they put all their efforts into a vaccine. And the vaccines that came out in 1990, you had to buy a vaccine and then buy boosters during the year. So it was just like raining money if they could make that work.
Right. Right.
And so the same thing happened with COVID. And
A
same thing happened
vaccine
with Lyme.
subscription service.
Right.
That's where the money is these
I mean,
days.
I sometimes tell my friends that Lyme disease is the prequel to this SARS-CoV-2 fiasco. But the incentives, the point is, the incentives in medicine changed. All of a sudden you discover a dangerous new disease. Rather than sharing information amongst scientists, the compounding of good ideas through conferences and journals, you were partners with Big Pharma, and whatever you discovered was intellectual property and it's top secret, and so you can't share it. So in a way, Lyme disease is frozen in time because it's this profiteering.
Wow. What do you recommend for folks who get Lyme disease or test positive and those that are suffering from more chronic issues?
There's some really good websites to go to find doctors who are very experienced in treating these complicated multi-microbe chronic diseases. And I mean, I would say if you had a rare brain tumor, you would just Google who is the best person for treating that rare brain tumor. Same with Lyme disease. If you go to, like, my experience, I went to a parade of infectious disease specialists in California who don't recognize it or treat it. Maybe in med school, they spent 15 minutes on all tick-borne diseases. So you need to get these experienced tick-borne disease doctors who go to the annual conferences, see the cutting edge treatment protocols, which aren't in the medical journals because they've circled the wagons around their Lyme is easy to treat, cure dogma. So anyways, let me just say the websites that are good. LymeDisease.org, easy to remember.
Okay. Yep.
They have a good search database. The group of frontline Lyme treating clinicians, their group is called ILADS, ILADS. They have protocols and they have a search engine for good doctors too. Go to your local support group, people who've lived through their misdiagnoses, and they can direct you to good people too. Because whenever you have a large group of sick patients, there are predator doctors who can take advantage of you. So
Right.
I would say be careful, but you can never change. I tell this to people. You can't change the mind of a doctor who's convinced that whatever they learned in med school about Lyme, that it's a psychosomatic disease, it's a bucket for hypochondriacs. You can't change their mind.
Yeah.
So and every day
You can
live
change
with-
doctors.
Right. It's easier. It's going to be a little expensive because insurance companies won't pay for it sometimes, but
Okay.
you have to look at the long term. The cost of a chronic disease is way more than paying for a consult with someone who knows what they're doing.
Yes. 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 What do you see in the next? I mean, you talked about this vaccine trials. What do you see in the next, 5, 10, even 25 years?
Well, I'm optimistic. Like the new IGeneX test that will keep people from coming down with being misdiagnosed and becoming chronic. I have a lot of faith that our current healthcare people, so RFK Jr. had me on his podcast, and his whole family has been affected severely with Lyme disease. So I believe he is aware of it, and as soon as he gets his priority list done, he'll attack Lyme. And then Jay Bhattacharya, the head of the NIH, I know has read Bitten, and he acknowledges the evidence is strong and we need to address this. So I'm optimistic about that. And then the other alternative vaccines that are coming down the pike, the ones that address tick attachment and then the ones that neutralize the saliva. So I think those seem promising to me.
Well, that's great to hear you're optimistic. What are you working on next, and how can people find out more about you?
Well, I have a website, author website, krisnewby.com. I also have a Substack where I'm continuing to investigate what happened at ground zero and aspects like that. So that's Kris Newby at Substack. And then my next book is called Skull Valley, and it's about 1968 at the height of the biological and chemical warfare programs. 6,000 sheep dropped dead in the Utah desert. So I'm investigating that mystery and the long-term health effects of the people affected along with the sheep, because it wasn't just sheep.
Right. A lot of testing, nuclear as well, of course, in the
Nuclear.
a lot of Utah.
Yeah.
Yes, which is
So Dugway Proving Grounds did biological, chemical, and radiological warfare. And they had a tick program that was so crazy. The Smithsonian had been hired to collect ticks from all over the Pacific Ocean islands. And so they were always getting shipments in Dugway, Utah of these exotic ticks and doing experiments.
Great.
I know.
Well, I hope we've learned some lessons from history and we stop experimenting. And the experimenting we do is on healing and not on creating new bugs, viruses, and other things. So,
Right. I always think about like if all these brilliant scientific minds had been focused on curing diseases rather than creating them, and that's why, I mean, in a way, I'm I was on biological warfare, now chemical warfare. I was thinking about, well, how do these bright young scientists get trapped in these classified programs and they can't get out? That's what was going on with Willie. At a certain point, he wanted to get out and go to back to Europe, but it's like doing the blood oath with the mafia. He can't tell everybody about the great experiments he did.
right. You're not
It's all
publishing. You're not
classified.
publishing papers. Right.
Right.
You can't even put it on a resume. Much of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's
I
almost
can
like
hardly.
that's it.
I know.
The
So he
code of
was a made
omerta.
man. I know. He was a made man, but he could never leave.
Yes.
But that's what makes him,
yes.
and that makes him an interesting character because he turned it around in the end, and he grew a conscience. I mean, a lot of the people I interview, they'll go to their grave clutching their secrecy oath.
Yeah. And what did he say? What did he say at the end? I mean, I know he was suffering from Parkinson's.
Yeah, and he thought it was probably caused by Lyme disease, but he wouldn't totally commit. So I would say he was really mad. So as a scientist, you're told to tell the truth when you have discoveries, and then also in the discussion section of your articles to talk about, well, I think this disease is caused by the Lyme spirochete, but it could also be caused by this other rickettsia organism or the crazy worm we found in the ticks, because the worm was an exotic worm from another continent, that he found in the ticks too. Yeah. And so because I had his original drafts of many, many things, he published his discovery in Science magazine, which is the top tier magazine. But I had his original draft where he talked about this other germ that was very suspicious that he thought could have been causing the disease too. But by the time the article got to publication, that part had been deleted. And he said, I was told to cover it up. And you could tell that really made him mad. He had like steam coming out of his ears because he had the heart of a scientist. He knew the classic European rules about science where you say what you know and you say what you don't know, because you may be down a blind alley that's wrong. And in science discoveries, most things are wrong at first.
Right.
The Earth isn't flat. We just have there's new instruments and new data that, so that made him mad. He was angry. And he was angry that they were threatening his pension and his health insurance because he had a really sick wife. And so I think that's why he came through and had a partial whistleblower moment.
Yeah. Do you feel like he went to his grave with many unresolved issues? Do you feel like he was at peace when he passed?
No. I mean, there was some sort of investigation where he was the focal point of, where 2 sets of men in black came out and interviewed him about missing agents. And he even told his second wife, don't be surprised if you're grilled too. And so I would say his life at the end, his conscience he was tormented. He was tormented. And I think something about all that secrecy in that kind of business eats away at your soul. He had horrible relationships with his 2 sons. So it wasn't a happy end.
No. Well, any final thoughts for us, Kris?
Just don't do what we did. I mean, that's what drives me is, first of all, I don't want any family to go through what we went through. It was so horrible. And I get calls and letters all the time of it's still happening. And if the government did it, I want them to step in and fix it. And I want the medical community to wake up and see this is a serious disease like AIDS or something. And when it's in its chronic form, it's going to need a lot of work. So, so that's find the right doctor and get treated. Don't waste time.
Great. Well, the book is Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Kris Newby. The website is krisnewby.com. That's Kris Newby, Newby, krisnewby.com. Kris, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you having me on.
All right. All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.